All right, welcome back everyone to the story of David, and stuff is about to get real weird really quickly. So if you remember last week we talked about the story of David and Goliath. The week before that we kind of have the two other origin stories for David. So we have David by three methods ending up interacting with Saul and the royal family. And this further kind of tells the story of how David becomes a person of not just someone who is in the palace, but how does he become a person of prominence? That said, there are some very interesting dynamics, some things that I will tell you, or like we can talk about what this means, potential understandings, what scholars go back and forth about, because there's basically three episodes that we have, and the last one is a doozy. So let's go ahead and jump in. The first story we have for today is David and Jonathan. So we've met Jonathan before. We know that Jonathan does his own thing. He's willing to go off and kill a bunch of Philistines, even when his dad doesn't give him permission. And here we have David coming, or uh, this, or the beginning of chapter 18. Ooh, kind. There we go. I put your other one in the waiting room, Larry, so we weren't getting echoes.
Yeah, I got it shut off now.
Okay, cool. All right. So the beginning of 18 picks up right at the end of the other story of David killing Goliath, and then afterwards Saul bringing him basically into his area and going, "Who are you?" And we get the explanation of who David is. Like, hey, I'm the son of this guy. He lives in this area. And then so today starts with after David's finished speaking, telling him who he was, Jonathan, the son of Saul, Jonathan, it says the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. That is some very strong language. And I want to hear from you all what you made of this just very introduction at the beginning of 18 that Jonathan basically meets David for the first time, and it says that his soul is bound to the soul of David.
Yeah, that
I don't recall any language like this in the past about souls in this film, but it's really amazing.
Yeah.
I think the timing of it is a little strange when okay. I think in the earlier chapters, Saul wanted to know who David was so that he could have Abner send him out to the front and get killed. That's kind of my interpretation of what was going on there. But then kind of immediately, now Jonathan is his sort of pops up out of nowhere. And of course, many of us have looked at this passage and wondered about homosexuality, really.
Yeah.
And there is such the strength, like Sue said, that the strength of that emotion is puzzling.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry?
although the relationships between men and women in the Bible were like Saul says, well, I'll give my eldest daughter to him. And then around, well, that's all right. I've given her away to somebody else. I'll give another daughter to her. In other words, women get passed around because nobody asks what's her name if she loves David, although fortunately, apparently she did, And yet, here's two men come together, and it sounds like love at first sight. All of a sudden they're bound together. Well, does that mean just they're bound as fighters, as warriors, or are they being bound together in a more sexual sort of way? Yeah, it's just sort of funny.
Yeah, okay.
I will say this comes up again because this relationship is complicated. And this is one of those where it's very much a different world with different dynamics. I think all of what you're saying is true. So, like, notably, in this world, in this time, our modern idea of homosexuality did not exist. It just did not. There's a certain way, or in a certain sense, you were married off whether you wanted to or not. And that applied for men and women. It was your duty for reproduction. So, like, your own personal preferences didn't really matter. Even like you are lucky if you like David, or Saul's daughter is lucky. She already likes David. And she gets married off to someone she likes. But I mean, as we've seen before, doesn't matter if you are physically attractive. Their marriage is not based on this idea of love and romance. It's a business transaction. It's political transactions. And so what we see is our modern ideas of romance exist outside of marriage.
Okay.
And so that is where we can use a modern lens to look at their relationship. And I do think it's important because there are folks who will say, like, who claim that homosexuality is a modern invention of the modern world. And it's people who are same-sex attracted, they look at this and say, I have like this feels like my story. Like they see themselves there. And I think we should give room for a variety of people to see themselves here, but there's also a few other things that may be also going on. I don't want to like narrow it in like this is the only way you can understand it, although it's a very prominent way to understand these two. So the question becomes, why would Jonathan immediately connect with David? Like, what is it between these two that we already know from the stories we've told, which may be why these two are like magnets together?
Well, I didn't read it as a sexual thing. I read it as more that Jonathan, who's always had a mind of his own, thought that David was in danger and he wanted to protect him. And and they're both very similar in their being very good warriors.
So, I think the protection part comes later. Like at the beginning, David's not necessarily in danger immediately.
Well, it comes very quickly.
It does come very quickly, but the initial magnetism exists before that protectiveness. But that is one way to understand their relationship.
Right.
Jonathan could have like a big brother-like feeling towards David, where it's like that older brother protection. I'm going to wrap myself around you because you have a vulnerable position in this world.
Well, he was also, Jonathan apparently did not, you would have thought that Jonathan would have been competitive and threatened because he was the son, but he apparently wasn't.
So that's another good observation is, they're not really, they should be rivals, but they're not. Yeah, Gary?
I guess that's an option to be rivals, but I looked at it the other way. I thought that Saul and David had almost a father and son relationship, so that they really were like brothers.
Yeah, at the end it says, where was it? Verse 2 is Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. He's kind of an adopted son. That like you Saul's kind of taking him and being like, okay, you're mine now. You're gonna live in there's not a royal palace, it's a royal tent. But like you're gonna live with royalty and you're mine now. You are here.
Mm.
Sorry, Jesse, you've lost your son. He is mine. So there is that father-son, which would breed that like brotherly interaction. The fact remains, though, is Jonathan's the firstborn, and we've seen rivalries between brothers, between firstborns and not firstborns, where there's still a choice to not be competitive.
Mhm.
But I want to circle back. Gretchen, I remember you trying to say something a while ago. I don't know if you still had your thought.
It was Sue's comment about they were both warriors.
Mm-hmm. So why would that make a difference? Like how do we see the way that they are both warriors that might make that connection?
Oh,
Well, they have common experiences and they have a lot in common from that standpoint.
Mhm.
Comrades in arms.
I would argue there's another piece to it. Both of them have a similar temperament in how they approach battle. Jonathan's like, hey, shield bearer, come with me. We're gonna go mess up the Philistines. And he starts a battle because Jonathan's just cantankerous and willing to say, hey, let's go mess them up. David has a similar quality to him where he like runs up on the battlefield to like give his brother stuff and he's like, hey, what's going on? Oh, you need me to mess that guy up? Okay, I'm there, let's go. And that kind of willingness to just take risk and jump into battle is very similar between these two. So it's not just that they're both warriors, they have similar tendencies as warriors to like just
yeah.
jump in and
Doing
cause
their
havoc.
own, yeah, yeah, and not necessarily obeying orders. Uh,
Yeah.
Jonathan's behavior had sort of made it unlikely he would be the person who succeeded Saul, as I recall. He was a little too independent in what he wanted to do. He didn't necessarily follow rules.
And that is always a possibility that you hear stories of like the eldest in the or like the next in line has no interest in being king. Why would I want to be king? That means I have to have responsibility. I don't want responsibility. I want to just run off sometimes and cause havoc. Like, so that may be one of the reasons why Jonathan's actually not really competitive with David is Jonathan's not interested in being king. So the other facet that I just want to highlight that is also likely at play, and I think if we pull it into some of the modern experiences that we've heard from soldiers coming back from war, I'm thinking especially World War I and World War II, there was a sense of bonding that happened when your life is in that much danger that there's lots of stories of like, oh, I came home and people never understood. And that sense of closeness that it sounds romantic in a sense, but it's like such a deep understanding of suffering that it kind of transcends the idea of like romantic relationships and platonic relationships, but that intermeshing of souls because of mutual understanding and mutual basically trauma kind of creates this nebulous other category where it's very intimate, but not necessarily as we would think like erotic intimate, if that makes sense. Which that also might be at play here. Like we said, like has already brought up, they're soldiers. Which means they may have this other category that we don't really have language for in our current context. So, yeah, Gary.
Well, I've heard people talk about meeting someone that had common experience, say serving in a war, and you refer to them that they bond, they have a bonding.
Mhm.
There's some kind of a I don't know, invisible thread between them because of their common experiences.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm. And often those sorts of common experiences involve some sort of danger or risk
Right.
or being in a vulnerable situation, that maybe helps that understanding. I mean, who knows what it feels like to be shot at by some enemy,
Hmm.
That's not something you want to know. But if you've had to put up with that, that may place some mark on your psyche, that you can understand the similar feelings in another person.
Hmm.
You're witnessing, the horror of war. Uh, that's something unique, and I can see how somebody could bond with someone else that gone through the same thing because you don't want to talk about it. But the fact that you're in the same space with somebody that has gone through that same thing is kind of comforting.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This was just the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and
Mhm.
the big focus is that the survivors now are soon all going to be dead,
Mhm.
and their biggest fear is people are going to forget.
Mhm.
Hmm.
That they've got to preserve that memory, that acknowledgement that such a thing takes place, and it's that sort of understanding, I think, that might be at play here as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
So the last way to look at this, which is I think important, so as you see, there's many layers as to what might be drawing these two together. The last piece of it that I think just helps put our mind in the space, because these two are affectionate towards each other. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. These two are very affectionate, and we will continue to see this. And they're very open that they love each other. And we're not used to hearing this language in this way. But the thing that helps us understand kind of the culture of the time is understanding that the male and female spheres were very separated. Where, like, unless it was the women of your family, you didn't really interact with other women. You had like your wives, your daughters, maybe your sister and like your mother, but other than that, like the men had their sphere and the women had their sphere.
Mm.
And if there's no question of sexuality, then you can be much more affectionate with each other without there being suspicion.
Mm.
And this is one of the things that I would say is one of the sad repercussions of having the LGBTQ movement push for more acceptance and inclusion, which I think is a good thing. People should not be discriminated against because of who they love, but it put into question in our common culture of, oh, this man is being affectionate towards me. Is he hitting on me or is he being a friend? And
Mm.
before that was a question, we see that the relationship between men used to be much more openly affectionate.
Mm.
We see, I mean, and this is even like going back only like 150 years, like hugging, kissing, like holding hands, all of that stuff was acceptable between men. It's only when sexuality gets brought into the question does that get pushed away.
Mm.
Like very much like an like a and there's even writings that like a like close male friendship was actually more important than your relationship with your wife. And like male spaces, male clubs were very valued. And it seems sad that that's gone away to the point where affectionate male friendship seems very rare in that like openly showing that affection. So when we see texts like this, the open affection between these two, we automatically like shunt it into the category of, oh, these two are gay. Like that's a valid reading and I think an important way to look at the text, but I think it's also important to understand that men used to be affectionate with each other.
Yeah, yeah, and women still can do that. That's one of the advantages of being a woman.
Right, because this question of sexuality was never as focused on women's sexuality.
Even think about that.
Yeah.
Well, women weren't supposed to have any.
Actually,
Well, men can't do sports together. I think the sports is a link. You know, see how the football players pat each other's fannies? At least they used to. I don't know if they still do.
Yeah.
this is
They
funny.
do.
Reading some text, some of Victorian era text, women were actually well known to practice on each other to get good
Yeah.
training before they were wives, which I'm just like, so like finishing school, it was very common for like college age women to practice being affectionate with each other, and it was just improper once they left school. Anyways, that was never a concern. Anyways, Gretchen, I know you're trying to jump in there.
It was already mentioned. I think the sports is the closest thing that we see now.
Yeah.
Sports and hunting and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Or I just finished a book called A Walk in the Park about these two men who walk in the Grand Canyon. And, there's no sense of any kind of sexual relationship, but it is obvious that they care a great deal about each other. And,
Yeah.
but again, that's a position kind of like Larry mentioned earlier, that there's a time of risk and danger. And so there's a bonding that takes place in the midst of doing something that is really foolhardy, actually.
I mean, it is interesting that we see the popularity of sports really has like big surges after people come home from war. Because there's a sense of like masculinity of like, there's no battlefield to go out to. Where do I go? And so a lot of our sports mimic a battlefield. And so there is some scholarship about how like the emergence of football in like our modern idea took off after World War II or World War One. World War One, they came back and they're like, wait, there's no way to prove myself. And so sports became a thing. And so it's not surprising that similar camaraderie would develop in the sports world that we also see in the military world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Larry?
The other place, it seems to be accepted within families too. I had two fishing companions, a father and son.
Mm-hmm.
The father in his 80s, the son in 50. They regularly kissed one another when they saw, nobody thought anything of that. I mean, it was just a nice, warm father-son type relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know we are still fixated on the first sentence of this chapter, but this is what I wanted to like lay out all of these options because David and Jonathan are going to interact repeatedly, and I wanted us to kind of understand the fluidity of what might be going on between these two. Because it'll be towards the end of the book, but there is passages about these two kissing in a field. And there's a certain point where it's like, what do you do with two men kissing in a field? How do we understand this? And this is kind of where the origin is, that there is something that is dynamic that brings these two together. what that is, we will truly never know. Some people need to see it one way to understand themselves and their own world. I think it is not a bad take to use them to think about what affectionate male friendships would even look like, because I do think it's missing in the world. And Sue, I'm with you. I feel bad because like women can be openly affectionate, no problem. But it just bringing up all of those questions. Anyways, let's keep moving. What we see is once again, David's taken into the royal household. Jonathan makes a covenant with David. Like this is the other thing where it sounds like other things we have in society today. Like we talk about marriage as making like promises or making a covenant with each other. So these two male friends have a covenant between each other because they love each other. So this is really where we start to see some of these interpretations come out. He loved him as his own soul. Jonathan strips down and takes all of his armor off and puts it on David, which is almost like giving up his position as heir to the throne. So it seems like Jonathan is in tune with things, with the narrative of the story, where Saul is not. He is not threatened. He is like, okay, I am the son's firstborn son, heir to the throne. David, you get all of my armor. You get my position. It's thrust on you now. Gives him his bow. And David goes out and is successful. And all the people approve of this. Like everyone sees this as a good thing.
Well, they're winning. You know, they can really, they don't have any choice but to, and well, I always think of Saul as having second kind of underlying reasons for sending David out all the time, but in a way, he did it, and it worked for David. It did not work for Saul. It was good for David's life, not good for Saul's ego, not good for his soul, not good for his spirit.
He was kind of hoping that David would get killed in battle.
That's what I always think, that
Yeah.
he had that. But David, no, look at it. I mean, he's a man.
Well, the first thing that we see is they come back to town after killing the Philistines, and all the ladies are dancing and they're singing, and they're like, yes, King Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And like immediately these, like Saul is insecure that like these, whether it's true or not, that's a different question. The people think David has killed more people on the battlefield, which is a sly way to say like David's more of a man than the king is. So does Saul have a right to be threatened by David? Or is this reasonable from a human perspective? Or is this Saul being unreasonable? I guess.
He doesn't want to pass the torch yet, that's for sure.
No, he's the king.
It's good to be the king. I from an old movie, but I think this is reasonable behavior that is not unlike the human condition of jealousy and envy, and it gets to Saul eventually. It becomes more and more against him as he goes forward, and these are natural feelings, but he feeds them.
So the emotion is human, but the reaction is the response to the human emotion is not a good response, is what I'm hearing.
That's what I'm saying. But who am I to say? I'm not the king. So I like this little thing. So Saul eyed David from that day on.
Yep. So it's pretty
Yeah.
quickly that David, so we have like the three origin stories of David of like how he comes to prominence. The first one, Saul isn't even in the picture. David just gets anointed off screen as far as Saul is concerned. The second one, David's brought in as a musician. The third one, David has this like military win. And it seems like no sooner is David brought into the royal family, does Saul also get like his discomfort with David starts almost immediately as well. Saul is threatened by this young man that everyone seems to love.
Mhm.
So the next big scene that we have is not on the battlefield. This one connects to the second origin story of David. They're just in the royal tents, and Saul has an evil spirit from the Lord, as we've already seen come upon him. Whatever that means, he is in some kind of state, in some kind of fit. And we know he has his eye out for David because he is insecure about this young man. And he decides to take a spear and throw it at him. And David dodges it, or like David's there playing music and he evidently dodges the spear, and Saul throws it at him 3 times and he dodges it every time. So Saul is now afraid because he's like, okay, God, I just threw a spear multiple times at this kid and he keeps dodging. God must be with him. I am now more suspicious. So what do you take of this? Of the basically a mad king throwing a spear at the musician?
I would think David got the message that he was no longer a favorite.
A little subtle, but it was so subtle. You're no longer a favorite, by the way.
Yeah.
This is something that you said that when we read this, and when I read this anyway, I picture these people being in houses.
Mm.
And this emphasizes that. He would pin him to the wall.
Oh yeah.
That's a house story, and that's not really true. I mean, I think that's interesting, just that we get that.
Yeah. And also were the writers trying to show that this wasn't all Saul's fault, or that this is an evil spirit, it's something external to Saul that made him throw that spear.
So there's a few ways to understand this, because the weird part that I still haven't found a good explanation for in researching this is it's not an evil spirit, period. It's not demonic. Frankly, we don't, there's not really been demonic spirits in scripture yet, as we saw some very early on in Genesis where we have like the Nephilim and these grotesque creatures that are like the sons of God mated with the daughters of man. But the idea of like the devil and demons doesn't exist in this part of the world at this point in time. It just doesn't. That development comes much later. We have to get to Job before we even get the Satan, which is still an angel at that point in time. We've talked about it before, but so there's no devils or demons in the world. So the evil spirit comes from God, which is not how we are used to understanding God as being like all-knowing and benevolent and loving. this kind of implies that God is responsible for the good and the evil of the world, and it all comes from God, which is why you want to be on God's good side, because if you get on God's bad side, God's going to send an evil spirit.
Mm.
Which is weird for our understanding today to kind of how do we look at this? Because most people are uncomfortable with evil coming from God.
Mm.
But that's what the text says. That is very much what the Hebrew says. There is no denying that that's what's here. We see, though, that the reason why Saul has an evil spirit is as punishment for not doing what God said earlier. So this is a repercussion of his actions, but it's also, so there's like a both and, where there's a guiltlessness in it, because it implies that Saul, if he was in his right mind, wouldn't be doing this. At the same time, Saul's not innocent, because this is the repercussion of other actions that he has done. This is where we land. People who want to make historical sense out of this text will say that Saul has had a mental break and may be suffering from schizophrenia. That would be the modern medical understanding. And we see this, that like with people who struggle with schizophrenia, they have episodes where people would say like they are not themselves. They are a different version of themselves. And then there's the points where they are very clear-minded and they have a different personality, and they kind of like come into themselves, which is why people kind of ascribe that here. So we don't fully know what's going on, but there's this, you're right in saying that there's a little bit that tries to give Saul a little bit of innocence here. Of he is kind of going insane. But yeah, Gary, what's your thought?
But no matter what you classify or how you classify his condition, the source is God.
Yeah.
So God has really just abandoned Saul.
And there are some or one other interpretation is Saul spent so much time with God's spirit with him that is merely the absence of God's spirit being with him is what's driving him mad. It is purely the absence, because God's spirit has gone from him, that would drive him mad. So we now have the dynamic setup that will last until the end of this book, where we have Saul is going to try to kill David at every turn, but he is also inconsistent. He will have mood swings. Saul is moody from this point forward. But we also have Jonathan, who is trying to protect David at every turn from his dad, because Jonathan loves David. And so this will be the dynamic going forward. And so the first, or where we see this dynamic first kind of be at play with all of these forces, is David's marriage to one of Saul's daughters. So the first one, the notes were interesting because this still goes back to the Battle of David and Goliath, because the prize for defeating Goliath was supposed to be Saul's daughter's hand in marriage. And so this kind of circles back onto that, but is also different. So Saul says to David, so like, you can have my eldest daughter, but like, you have to be valiant and fight the Philistines. So it's not like, oh, you won her, congratulations, here's your prize. It's kind of an ongoing arrangement of, oh, you can have her, but you have to keep fighting wars for me. And his plan, Saul's plan, is if I can get him out on the battlefield, he's going to die. I'm going to make him go to war and I'm just gonna hope I never have to see him again.
Mhm.
And so that is Saul's goal. And so what do you think of this, of the offering of a daughter in marriage, but it's almost a pawn to get David killed?
Well, it reminded me of what David did later when he wanted Bathsheba, and he sent Bathsheba's husband off to war.
Yep,
The same story.
it is the same method, yes. So he learned a thing or two, evidently, from Saul.
Mhm. Well,
Mhm.
is this action the evil spirit sent by God, or is Saul really sort of this sort of guy?
So going
Oh.
do you want the literary answer or the like textual history answer? Because those two are not the same.
Oh, well, let's hear them both.
Okay.
Yeah,
So the first thing that I'll say is like if you're going at this from an academic sense, what we've already talked about is David has three origin stories that come from three sources. We see that one of the origin stories is David was brought in as a musician. And so Saul trying to kill David is the previous story from that line of logic. Like you could almost take your scissors, cut out that scripture of David being in the palace. I'm going back and forth here. You're bringing up that he was gonna pin him against the wall. What might be the case is Saul has taken residence in a pre-built structure. A palace does not exist, so I'm trying really hard not to say the palace because there is no palace. But the royal abode. So
Okay.
David has been brought into the royal abode to play music, and you could see how that story can just pick up and say an evil spirit came and Saul tried to kill him. And you can see that the story of David and Goliath interrupts that narrative. And so, from a textual analysis, you can say, oh, there is a series of stories of David being musician in the palace and Saul being tormented by an evil spirit, because the evil spirit always goes with the stories of David's music.
Mhm.
And so you can cut apart those stories and stitch them together, and you have a complete story.
Mhm.
On the other hand, you have the story of David and Goliath. And if you take out Saul trying to kill David and David being a musician, you see a story of David rising to prominence because he's a good military guy, him being insecure, and then him trying to send David out to battle. And there's no mention of an evil spirit.
Mhm.
So we have two stories, once again, as we see in a lot of other places in the Bible, that have been Frankensteined and picked apart and stitched back together. So if you're taking these stories on their own merit, Saul trying to marry off his daughter and send David out to battle, he's just being a jerk, is what he's doing. He is insecure. He doesn't like that the women think that David's a better military guy, so he's sending him to the front lines. The evil spirit is interwoven into this and kind of gives a different, if you see it as the story as it has been put together, yes, you would say that the evil spirit made Saul do this. So take it as you will. That said, David says, oh, no. I'm way too poor to afford to be your son-in-law. Basically, he doesn't have the money for a dowry. So he's like, that's lovely. I'm gonna pass. No, thank you. And so his eldest daughter gets married off to someone else. Gets married off to I believe a general. But Saul has more than one daughter, and so a younger daughter is in love with David. She has a good old crush on him, and Saul's like, okay, here's another chance. This daughter actually wants David. Maybe he'll be interested in her. And so he puts forward, and once again, it is with the idea that Saul is trying to have him killed. So he is using his daughters like pawns. Like he's not caring about his daughter's well-being or what she's going to think about if her dad essentially kills her husband in battle. But once again, David's insecure because he's not wealthy, and Saul comes up with an idea that the dowry for his daughter will be the foreskins of the Philistines, depending on which translation you get. One version says 100, one version says 200. I believe the older version says 100, so somewhere along the way it got inflated to 200. But David is to collect at least 100 foreskins of Philistines, which is weird. Yeah, Gretchen.
Do you see the triangulation in all of this with Saul not really talking to David directly? He's saying to his servants, "Oh, go mention this to." I think it's a very a family systems person would have a lot of fun with that. I think that whole. But go ahead with the foreskins.
Oh, no, I love that point. Is like, you see, Saul is not wanting to talk to David directly.
Yeah.
So that's a much more practical thing to view in this scripture, is like the triangulation. And it's a way to kind of obscure what's going on. If you're using a middle person, it intentionally muddies communication. So, but what do you think of the bride price?
Yeah,
Larry.
Why wouldn't you think 100 sheep or 40 goats or something rather? But who dreamed up this as a dowry?
So the question, so there is a reason why Saul is doing this. It is weird. And everyone acknowledges this is weird. Saul is being a weirdo. But there is a direct reason why this might go into Saul's weird plan. So, any ideas of why he would specifically choose Philistine foreskins?
Well, it certainly identifies the Philistines as non-Jewish.
Correct.
Or foreigners or enemies.
The others.
The other.
It's just one more really creepy thing.
So I hate to go down this route, but it helps to understand, because there's part of me that I have so many questions, and I don't want any of them actually answered, but I still have questions. But one of the thoughts is, in order to collect them, you have to kill either 100 or 200 Philistines, but you also have to make sure that other Philistines aren't around, because the idea of like lifting up their skirts to like do the little chop to each one, other soldiers are not going to be happy if you are desecrating corpses. And so it's a dangerous thing for him to collect. Because he has to kill a lot of people. B, because it's not just killing them. He has to desecrate their corpse in a very specific way. And if anyone catches David desecrating the corpse this way, David's gonna get killed. So it's actually designed, like part of the grossness of this is actually trying to put David in a very awkward position to get him killed. It's not just we're going to send him to battle. We're going to send him to battle so he can desecrate corpses and hopefully someone notices and offs him.
So you assume that David didn't tell his second in command what the assignment was.
Well, actually, we're pretty sure that David did, which makes this even weirder. To like have your general say, hey, we're gonna kill a bunch of Philistines, and then like afterwards we have to collect some body parts. Like that's weirder. That makes it worse in some ways.
Yeah, David didn't personally amputate everyone.
Well, it almost implies then that really every Philistine who was in that battle was killed.
Yes.
Because if anybody had been left, they would not have allowed their brother to be maimed.
Correct.
But yeah, and that's really what they're supposed to be doing is they have a battle.
That's right.
Yeah.
Isn't that what God says? You should wipe them out utterly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, God is really most interested in killing anybody who interferes with Israel, yeah.
You know, that might be the reason that the number went from 100 to 200, because they couldn't take, you know, any prisoners at all. They had to get rid of everybody that they witnessed what was going on.
No, so one of the issues is I am by the notes, I know there's a difference. I don't know which one's which. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And so the entirety of the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. And for a long time, that is what Christians used to read, or like, and then it was translated from Greek into Latin, and so it was like a double translation, and things got lost in the process. And so in the Septuagint has a different number than the authoritative Hebrew that we use, and so there are sometimes, this is one of the things where translation gets messy and some misunderstandings happened because we were reading Latin for so long that was based on the Greek, that was based on the Hebrew. And so somewhere in that process, the number changed. And so it was a translation issue. And now we no longer know which one's the more authoritative one. So it wasn't like it grew at the time of like David actually had to kill more people. It's a translation thing. At any rate, the thing is, Saul's plan backfires. Not only does David complete the task, and the other part, the final part that's just weird. It's like this story is weird. David then goes back to Saul and counts them one by one in front of him. They're like, okay, here's one foreskin, here's two, and I'm like,
got them by 10s or by 20s or by 5s.
I just like, once again, I have questions. I don't want them answered, but it's like, how did you collect like these are flesh things? Did you dry them out so they didn't rot? Like, how did you keep them separated so they didn't just like congeal into like a mat? Like, I don't want these questions answered, but my brain goes these places that I'm just like, I don't. Did you put them in a little bag or did you like string them up on a string? I don't want to know. Anyways, so they count them off one by one in front of the court because they're counting them in front of Saul. And Saul gives his daughter in marriage. He's like, okay, you did the thing. But not only that, David, like the public opinion of David increases because he went to battle and he defeated all of these Philistines, and he has proof he defeated all these Philistines, and he won the princess's hand in marriage. And so now David looks even better than he did before.
Can you just see it now? I mean, somebody could do a spoof on this. I'm in here. Well, we only have 97, so we got to go back. The whole thing.
Go back and find 3 more Philistines.
Right. Oh, man.
Or just pretend they're Philistines. It doesn't really matter who we get.
We just need some foreskins out there. Oh, anyways, and so David, like being put out on the front lines again and again, and David's evidently a really good military guy, and Saul has put him as a general because he's like, hey, I don't want him near me. I'm gonna put people in control of him, and he's good at the job. And so Saul's every attempt at making David die is making David successful. So what do you think of this dynamic? Is this because the Lord is with him, or is this because Saul's an idiot?
It's great storytelling. You just have to admit this. This really
Yeah,
all
yeah.
these Old Testament. I mean, this is three in one little. I mean, they weren't chapters then, but three right close together that further illustrate the craziness of Saul. Really,
Mhm. Yeah, the little vignettes.
yeah.
The little vignettes of this are just, yeah. So do we want to turn this last one into a Sunday school coloring page? When we learned about King David, we didn't get this story. Yeah, Larry.
There was a movie made, though, during World War II, in which a Jewish undercover agent was impersonating a Nazi. And he got outed by when it was found out that he was circumcised.
Huh.
And that was the thing that gave him away.
Hmm. Well, that would be one that they'd be showing on TCM right now. Like last night, for example, had, terrible hard movies. Sophie's Choice, The Pawnbroker, Exodus. Oh my gosh. I didn't watch it. I watched Antiques Roadshow, but they do a good thing with themes like that. I mean, it's and that's one I haven't seen. That's huh. That's the thing against communal bathrooms. You got to get rid of them. Oh dear.
We're nearing the end of our time for today. What do you take of this chapter? It's been a bit of a roller coaster.
I'm glad it's behind us.
Yeah.
Well, I think it illustrates very much the human nature, our self-centeredness and our desire for us rather than the other. I mean, who has not been jealous of somebody at some point in their life and done bad things probably because of it? That's the part we could do for Sunday school, I guess. But
yeah.
Still, it almost re-emphasizes the concept of them and us. It's drawing the line, a very distinct line, suggesting that, there is something that says, yeah, this group is different from us.
Yeah, one of the arguments that I've heard that I think is an interesting way to see the trajectory of the Bible is seeing the promises of God start. I mean, if ignoring some of the beginning stories of Genesis, when you see the covenants of Abraham, and it kind of the family grows, and then you have a tribe, and then you have a nation. But if you connect that trajectory with Jesus, what you see is an opening up to kind of almost do away with the us versus them, where it's almost like humans needed to grow up a little bit. Like they're dealing with a very us versus them we need to protect our own. But by the time you get to the book of Acts, you see, well, in the gospel narratives, we see all of a sudden, like, I am sent only for the sheep in the house of Abraham. And then even Jesus, like, cracks the door and it's like, wait, we need to talk to the people who aren't the children of Abraham. And then from Acts on, you just see the story of God getting wider and wider. And actually, by the time Paul is actively trying to break down the barriers between us and them. And so it is always dangerous to take a single plumb line and say, this is how we should always be. But it's curious to see the overall trajectory of like who is included in the story. Because yeah, the us versus them here, like the Philistines might as well be animals. They're subhuman in the way that the story treats them.
Yeah.
And I would argue that that's not good.
Yeah.
Just because it's in the story doesn't mean that we should replicate it.
You're right.
But I do think it's a good observation to see that, like, that is there.
And didn't you say that the Philistines were a more advanced society?
Yeah. 100% they were. They had better technology. Let's see.
Coast, going to sea. Wow.
I'm gonna write myself a note, and for next time,
That's
I'm going to find a date
Didn't they
or
have
like when they think this is going on, and I want to like look at the rest of the Mediterranean world, because I want to know at what point in civilization the rest of it is. Because like, is this when the Minoans were at their peak? Like, I want to know who was the ruling empire. I mean, Egypt rules for a long, long time, and that's a thing. But it's like, where's the rest of the where is the development in the Greek society? I don't think Athens and Sparta were created yet. It's a little bit too early for them. So let me see if I can get some contemporaneous things to kind of put this in context. Because yeah, the Philistines are a lot more advanced. We just know this.
You say that they used bronze or something in their weapons?
Yeah.
And that's the way I pictured was the reason Jonathan went off on his own to try to break into their garrison.
Yeah. They're trying to steal the higher tech.
Yeah.
The other thing we've seen in other points is like the chariots are like, granted, they probably didn't have chariots because they're a seafaring culture, but when they battle other higher tech civilizations, they have lighter weight, faster chariots, which is basically they perfected the spoked wheel. Developing a wheel is one thing, but a spoked wheel is a lot harder. And if you can make the components with bronze, it's lighter weight and faster. And so like there's major technological differences between societies at this point. And they're in different stages. Like we say, like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, they're at different levels of like development that way. So let me see if I can find a few contemporaneous cultures to kind of put it in context. In the world, at least.
Okay.
But with that, let us wrap up for today. Can I pray us out?
Yes.
All right. Gracious and loving God, this was a wild story, God, and the text says that you are in the midst of it, that you are present with David, and that you sent an evil spirit to Saul. And God, we don't always know what to make of these things. But the emotions in it, God, we see can still ring true. So help us when we have situations where we feel intimidated or where we feel jealous. Help us deal with it in ways that are not manipulative, in ways that actually deal with the heart of the problem so we can admit these emotions rather than acting in fear or anger. help us understand what affection looks like between friends, that we may show not just our unhappy emotions with each other, but we may be able to celebrate with each other. We may tell stories and find closeness within our communities. But God, I just ask that you be with us with this group, specifically in the cold winter days of the end of January, and be with us until we are able to gather again together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everyone.
Chris. See you next week.
Bye all.
Yeah.